In this video, we're going to look at what happens when you create a new object. In my code here, you're seeing that I'm creating a new object and assigning it to the person variable, and I'm using something called object literal syntax. What this means is that I'm literally creating an object using these curly brackets. When you create a new object, I find it useful to have an image of what's actually happening. And I think a good image for that is thinking of objects as a table or a container that gets created for us. And so I've drawn this table over here on the right, and what the table will contain is on the left some properties. Let me grab this regular pen. So the left here we're going to have properties, and then each one of those properties will have values. So on the right column will have these as values. And so every time we create a new object using this object literal syntax, I want you to think of a new one of these tables being created in memory. Now, the first thing that we'll do with this object is start to add properties to it. We can add a property to this person object by using the dot notation. So I'm going to create a property called name, and then we're going to assign that to a value. And in this case, the value is going to be a string, and the string will be Chris for my name. So let's fill in this table. So now our table has one property, and the property key is person, name, and its value is a string. Let's add another property. And we'll just sort of make up properties here. We'll call this one year, and its value will be 2014. So now our table has another property. We'll call it year, and we'll fill in the value, which will be this time a number. And so this table can grow indefinitely with new properties that we add to our person object. And the properties are just arbitrary keys like name and year, and the values can be any of the JavaScript types. A value might even be a function. For example, I might have a function called getName. And so the property key is getName, and the value is a function. That might just return the name property. So I'll add one more property to our table over here, and its key is going to be getName, so its key or its property name. And the value for this will be a function. Another way that we can create properties on this object is by using index notation. So instead of saying person.name, I can use these brackets and then provide the name of the property as a string or a variable. So for example, in this case, the property name is name. And then again, I'll just assign that to the value Chris. And you can use double quotes or single quotes here, it doesn't matter. And I could do the same thing for year. Now, oftentimes you use index notation like this when the name of the property is a variable. So for example, I might have something like this, and then inside of the brackets, I use the variable name to assign this property to the value 2014. And this can be useful when we're copying objects from one to another, for example, or if we have a function that takes a property name as a parameter. So that's all objects are. You can just think of them as these tables, and the tables have properties and the properties have values. And so we can add as many properties as we want to the object and assign values to those properties. Now there's two other ways that we can create this object, that we can tell JavaScript to create this space or this container for us. So far we've been using this syntax here, which is called object literal syntax. A second way that we can create the person object, let me comment this out, is to use the new keyword and to give a constructor function. I'll explain more about how this works in a different video, but I'm going to show you that we can call new and then use the object constructor function, and this will create a new object that's empty. So these two lines here are equivalent. The third way that I can create this object is by using the object.create method. These last two ways of creating objects are typically if we want to affect inheritance, and we'll talk about inheritance in a specific different video. But oftentimes you'll see people creating objects just simply using this object literal syntax. Another benefit of using object literal syntax is that we can define the properties in line. So instead of adding properties programmatically down here, we can just create key value pairs like this. And so we have the property name on the left, and then a colon, and then the value on the right. And so this is a very compact kind of syntax, and it's very conducive to creating objects quickly inside of our code and passing them around. Okay, so now we don't have to assign these properties directly because we've done it inline in our object literal. So most of the time you'll see people creating objects like this using object literal syntax because it's a more compact format, and we can assign the properties and their values directly in line. And when you see this kind of syntax, you should think of this table over here getting created for you. Now before we end the video, let's go over to the JavaScript debugger console and take a look at this object. When you're working with objects in JavaScript, I find that it's very useful to be able to interrogate them from the debugger in Chrome Developer Tools. And so what I've done is I've opened up the console for JavaScript and I typed person, and what I get back is the object for that variable. And what you can do is to expand the object and take a look at its properties and values. And so here we have our get name assigned to the value of a function, and the name assigned to a value of a string, and the year to a value of a number. You can see this other special property here called proto, and we'll talk about that when we get to inheritance. In this video, I showed you 3 different ways to create a new object, and we looked at a useful mental model for what's happening when you create an object. Specifically, you can think of it as a table or a container that has properties and values.